Welcome, everybody. This is Writing Non-Human Beings. Uh, Hopefully, we have a lot of humans here. Maybe some non-humans. I don't know. Um, Thanks for coming. Hopefully, you're having a great convention. We are in Bartholomew on Discord. If you would like to leave us a question, put it on there. Maybe write question in front of it just so I can find it again when I'm scrolling back through. Because we're going to save questions, I think, towards the end. I think that's the way I'd like to do this. Um, yeah, the panel description I'll go ahead and read. Non-human characters, whether scientific, fantastical, or superhuman, are staples of speculative work. Often these characters are convenient to use as villains or exemplars where human characters aren't plausible. But what makes a character non-human, and what do our portrayals of these characters say about our views of humans and othered persons? We'll discuss all of this with stops along the way for an exploration into human, alien, and monstrous brains and what their differences mean for their perception and understanding of the world. Great. So that's what we're going to do. I'll start off. I am your moderator, Luke Elliott. I am a writer of speculative fiction and a podcaster myself. I host the Ink to Film podcast with my co host, who is a filmmaker named James Bailey, and we talk about book to film adaptations on there. And I like talking craft, so this is a very interesting thing for me to get into. My first pro qualifying short story is out in Reckoning 6 this year, and it features a non-human protagonist. So I think that's why I was selected to be the moderator here. And I would like for everybody to go around, introduce themselves, and then maybe share the most recent non-human character maybe you were writing about or from. I think that would be interesting. So mine was actually in my novel I'm working on, and it was a sentient cephalopod who is a big movie nerd. But yeah, it was fun, and I think that was the most recent one I wrote from. Anyway, let's go around and meet our panelists. I'm just going to go around in clockwise order here for me. So let's start with Rem.
Hi, I'm Rem Wigmore. I'm a science fiction, fantasy, and horror author based in New Zealand. I'm the author of the solarpunk novel Fox Hunt, out from Queen of Swords Press, and the upcoming sequel Wolfpack, and I have a few other works in various locations. My most recent thing that I wrote with like a significant non-human character, my last novel that I drafted in November didn't actually have many of those, which is a real outlier for me. But the last novella I wrote has a vampire in it, so it would be that vampire.
Awesome. Let's go to Valerie.
Hi, I'm Valerie Valdez. I'm the author of Chilling Effect, Prime Deception, and the forthcoming Fault Tolerance, all of them found family space opera stories, and all of them featuring a copious cast of alien characters. I call them non-humans in the books because I feel like alien has become kind of a loaded term. And my love interest, my main love interest in that series is a non-human, and I write about that. And so that was probably the most recent one that I've done. It's definitely not a Garrus Vakarian reference.
Uh, all right, let's go with Lawrence.
All right. I'm a writer and a technologist. I have an old background in AI and internet R&D, getting older every minute, it seems. I've published a whole bunch of short stories and a bunch of standard science fiction and fantasy magazines. I have a urban fantasy series. The latest one just came out a few weeks ago, Demons of Chioda. Our heroes go around the world from each volume, you see. They feature a number of types of non-humans in our contemporary world, demons, elementals, and things like that. I suppose the most non-human of those characters, because really they're mostly kind of human, is a demon who is summoned by a Yakuza boss in an act of self-possession, so they share their body. And due to some circumstances beyond their control, the demon winds up in a dagger for most of the story. So they're at least in a non-human body most of the time.
Love it. This is the fun stuff we get to do as speculative fiction writers, right? Okay, so I think let's start off with a fairly basic kind of topic setting question, and that's what makes a character non-human. And I'm talking about besides the obvious, like scientific, not species related, but what are some examples, perhaps from your own work? You've already touched on a few, or any other media that may be your favorites of, that we can sort of set the stage for what we're discussing here. Let's go around perhaps in the same order, I guess, and we don't have to do that the whole time, but let's do it for now. So, Rim, if you got something.
Yes, I have so many very educated and clever things to say about this. What I find really interesting about this is the times when it's like not clear. So as well as writing, like I write a lot of fae, there's like and monsters, and there's a bunch of like I have an AI character in the Fox Hunt sequel who I'm really interested in writing that like the thought patterns they have. But what I really like is that kind of gray area where you don't know if a character is human or not, like, and they themselves don't know, and the narration doesn't necessarily know. So, like, cursed characters like werewolves or people who are being possessed by demons or like things being poisoned by the corrupting influence of eldritch gods. Like, are they human or not human or human and? I think that's a really like fun area to explore.
Valerie?
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with that. In a lot of my stories, what I will if I make a differentiation is between humans and I guess the terms I would use are humans, non-humans, and people. And the thing is that the Venn diagram of it, everybody's people. If you're people, and some people are humans and some people are not humans, but they're all people. And I feel like we can get into more nitty-gritty definitions, and I think it definitely varies from story to story, from world to world, from author to author, how they define it within the context of whatever they're working with. But it really does interest me, like what qualities we tend to latch onto to determine what people are people and what people are not people in terms of things like sapience or what have you. In terms of physicality, even with that, once you start, oh, well, you have to have two arms. Well, there's people without two arms. Well, that can't possibly be a criteria. You have to have two eyes. Well, there's people without two eyes. There's humans today who are missing these things. And so the more you start to drill down into those kinds of definitions, the more inadequate they clearly are. So,
Love that. Lawrence?
Well, I mean, I love the question of these subtle and nuanced distinctions between humanity and near humanity. I'm inclined to draw the circle, that wider people circle, and really consider that boundary a little more closely, because I'm not sure what makes one of our ostensible human companions human versus almost human. But it's possible that there are conscious sapient entities which we nevertheless are not quite sure whether they're people or not. And what does that mean when we put somebody within the circle or outside it? In terms of distinguishing them, I guess you can look at it as a writer, I would say, an intentional, with an S point of view, or an extensional point of view, which means from the inside or from the outside by enumeration. So if I say, as a narrator, that is a non-human being, and I make it clear by having them not being able to speak, have their actions deliberately mysterious and confusing, I can very easily portray a sense of mystery and ambiguous or ambivalent peoplehood to a reader. But if I'm within their mind and I'm presenting their point of view on the page, it's going to be a lot more difficult for me to present non-peoplehood or even any degree of far from humanity peoplehood, let us say.
Yeah.
So there's some real challenges there.
And it feels like we're touching on questions that have like plagued philosophers for millennia. So only so far we can get into that. But I'm going to use this as a segue into a certain question I had, because I think it's sort of following this line of thought, talking about human minds versus non-human minds. So the reality is we know that different minds work differently, different brains work differently. Sometimes we're creating fictional monsters or aliens. We're imagining aliens. We're imagining artificial beings, that sorts of thing. And we're trying to come up with, as writers, how they think in a way that is realistic, or if that's our goal, believable, and also entertaining. So I'm curious, how might you imagine different types of characters thinking, and in whether in your own writing or future writing, or just like what sort of resources would you use, and what sort of strategies would you use for your writing to try and convey that in a way that's going to be interesting and entertaining for a reader, but also accurate, and avoiding potential problems that can come up. So, which we'll get more into in my follow-up question. But let's go in a different order this time. How about Lawrence? You want to start us off this time?
Sure. So this is a very challenging question and a challenging problem for writing. It's just like, well, it's analogous to the difficulty you have when writing about some extraterrestrial and not using terrestrial life forms to compare them to. So, this is a snail lizard combination. No, let's just, you wind up falling back to that type of simile or that type of descriptor because it's so difficult to present true alienness or true something beyond or transcending our understanding as we have it now. Within technique, in writing technique, you can do it simply by withholding information from the reader. So this non-human character's motivations, you explain it in some rational way, which may or may not be in line with normal human cognition or motivation, but it would make that character bald or implausible or unbelievable if you explained everything. So this character just can't talk in addition to whatever else they can do, but they're important in some other means and they communicate through some other modality. I wind up often either subtracting or adding from conventional humanity, or as I understand conventional humanity. So I might focus on some particular drive or ambition or desire that this character has, which is far more extreme in expression than a normal or a typical, rather, human would express. So where a human is implausible as the perfect soldier or the perfectly desirable universal lover or whatever it might be, somehow the non-human character is more plausible. Or they might have a complex combination of qualities which humans typically don't carry together, something like that.
All right. Valerie, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, to add on to what was already said, I think definitely the use of language is one way that you can approach it. You think about what kinds of words and images and symbols that the non-humans are going to be tending to rely on, and what sort of sensory filters they're going to be using that may be different from the ones that humans use in the context of the story in the world that you're constructing. A thing that I think about sometimes is, and I'm probably going to muddle a lot of this, so please go look it up and read more about it. There are cultures in which there are deaf-mute people who have not been taught language for any of many reasons, and it's been shown that they form memories entirely differently from people who have been raised with any kind of language, whether that be a verbal auditory language or sign language. And so once they are taught language of any kind, be it sign language or what have you, it changes the way that they form memories. And that is a thing that comes to mind a lot when I'm trying to think of, like, okay, how am I going to portray the thought patterns, the memory formation, and how am I going to convey that in fiction? And so another thing to think about is like a story I like to look at is Love is the Plan is Death, James Triptree Jr. And that is one where you have these very alien feeling creatures who are experiencing human adjacent emotions, but in a way that can feel very different from the way humans experience emotions. And yet at the same time, the familiarity of it, I think, is what allows us to relate to the characters and what's going on. And so I think that relatability, that bridge between the human and the non-human, is something that you need to establish in order to have a sort of understanding, I guess, between them.
Yes, I definitely agree about having that bridge, because like the thing is, and I was also gonna Lawrence, I was gonna also bring up like the handy dandy craft trick of, if it's like a character you want to come off as like super alien, just writing them from like an external perspective, and then if you write from their own point of view, it's a lot more complicated to bring that across plausibly. And I think in terms of having that bridge, one of the things you kind of have to do is compromise between having a character that's truly alien, whose thought patterns might be incomprehensible to a human reader, versus having a character who's alien enough because depending on the kind of story you want to tell, you want your reader to be able to relate to them or to be able to understand them at least a little, which is where you get that that skill tactic of varying degrees, taking the human and changing them, or taking a very non-human thing and making it much more human, and having those realistic motivations. I really like when people do this in unconventional ways. Like, we've all read the story where it's like, this robot is no longer simply a robot because it has learned to feel romantic love, the most important emotion. And like, that can be fun to read, but also like to bring up Murderbot, as everyone invariably will in every panel that ever exists. What's so fun about Murderbot is like, it's extremely relatable because it's very relatable to any of us feelings of like being exasperated with its job and just wanting to watch shows. So like having that kind of quality is really fun as well. And then I can see why a lot of like sci-fi and fantasy authors use animals on our world as shorthand, because we probably aren't going to be able to like chat to a real alien or a real monster, but like we can look at an octopus and go, damn, that thing is weird. What if like a whole civilization of, I mean, octopuses are probably sapient, but like what if a whole civilization of like maybe more long-lived sapient creatures were like this? And that's why I think there's so many octopuses in space.
I love that idea of the bridge, though. I mean, on the one hand, uh, it if there is a bridge, then whatever the non-human character isn't completely non-human because there's some connection, even if it's a tenuous one that's been established. But on the other hand, is it really plausible that there would be cognitions out there that no possible bridge could be connected to, you know? I don't know I don't know which is less plausible, that there would be no bridge or that we'd meet people who just start chatting with us. I mean, I wrote this little first contact story. That was an attempt to explore the emotion, you know, of before the bridge is connected. And, you know, the alien in the first contact and the human are both terrified. They're both panicking, and they understand that they're experiencing uh, anxiety attacks, and that their behavior is irrational, but there's nothing they can do about it. But they both force themselves to perform that connection, of course, and that bridge establishes the link between two beings who are otherwise, you know, extremely different from one another.
Yeah, and I think a fun story that tried to do the extremely non-human creatures and in some ways succeeded, in some ways utterly failed, is that they're made out of meat. Terry Bisson, which is a cool
Yeah,
thing,
yeah.
of course, in which you have these non-humans who are essentially beings of energy, and they're discussing how horrifying it is that there are sapient creatures that make noises by, you know, pushing air through their meat holes, and just it's an attempt to look at humanity from an incredibly outside perspective, and yet at the same time it uses human language because we have to write stories in human language. It's what we are. We're humans. We can invent a conlang for an alien species, but it's still going to have human stuff in it. We cannot get outside of the Venn diagram to look at it from the outside. You know, we cannot reach the edge of the universe and then step outside of it and look back in. We do not have that capacity, and so we ultimately are always going to be limited by our human perceptions one way or the other, and so we can either rail against it or just kind of go with it.
I'd like to give a recommendation. A lot of people have probably seen the film Arrival, but if you haven't read Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, it is another good example of this, where the perception and difference between the aliens he uses there and humans, because they perceive time differently, basically creates the story. And I think that's a cool avenue as writers to follow, right? Like a difference in perception and how that might change the narrative. Um, I love all of that. Did you have any more you wanted to add, Rim? I didn't want to cut you off if you had a follow up.
I think I was like thinking, I agree with all of that. It's great. I think I was thinking earlier that like that's almost not that art has to have like an inherent value, and it has an inherent value, but that's almost one of the values of this kind of story is like you can read these stories about very different types of people being able to connect with each other and empathize for each other and look at it and go, oh, well, I could probably try and understand my annoying neighbor a bit better or whatever. And of course, much more serious examples as well in terms of learning real life tolerance and empathy. And that is one of the values that stories have.
Absolutely, and that's a good segue.
Ooh.
So, my story that I wrote recently deals with a giant digging machine that, like you were talking about before, is not recognizably bipedal or any of that. It's a big machine, but it has certain emotions that it's been programmed to feel, and it ends up developing a relationship with a rat in particular and a rat colony, which I had to do a lot of
Ooh.
research on, like how rats communicate and rat social structures and how their colonies form. And doing that sort of research informed the story. And again, I think this is a cool way to like juice up your creativity because you find things. And that was just like Googling stuff and finding research papers, scientific papers written about rat colonies that I would have never otherwise read, but I found really interesting. Um, but you were talking about the sort of real world implications because, of course, often when you're talking about things being metaphors and what lessons we can learn, we get more into thematic things about like why do this other than the sort of obvious like scientific like, oh, I would like to write what it would be like to meet an alien. um Often we are behind something else as writers, right? Like we have other things we're working through, other places we'd like to explore and talk about, and often that bleeds into metaphors for other things. So I want to talk about that for a second. What do our portrayals of these non-human beings say about our views of humans and other persons? What benefits are there to using these characters to explore these sorts of topics? And what are some potential pitfalls that we need to watch out for when attempting it, and maybe you've seen other people fall into? And let's start with Valerie this time.
Dun dun dun. Okay, Valerie has a rant prepared. I don't, but
Awesome.
I'm gonna do it anyway. So I think we actually have historically a lot of people who've been marginalized in various ways have ended up seeing themselves in these othered characters, in these non-human characters, because they don't see themselves in the human characters for any various good reasons. Usually because they are cishet white males that are engaging in all these awesome adventures with their non-human sidekicks or what have you. And so because of that, I think there's a responsibility that we have as writers to create these characters and sort of perform these characters in this with the same respect that we would give to any other sort of marginalized or othered people, because they often end up being stand-ins for that. And a lot of the same damage that you can cause by poorly writing marginalized characters can happen from poorly writing non-human characters, because many times they end up as stand-ins for some existing group. Look at the X-Men, for example. And so then you end up with stuff like the overpowered marginalized person trope, where it's like, well, these people are marginalized, but it's because they could blow us up, and then you're like, oh, well, then it's okay. Wait, no, it's still not okay. What are you talking about? So you just have to treat it with some sensitivity when you are engaging with these things, I think. And it behooves us to examine the ways in which we are writing non-human characters with those kinds of marginalizations as substitutes for actual marginalized people one way or another. What are we imprinting onto them? And if it is something, then we need to be careful. That's my
Yeah,
rant.
this is absolutely true. I think there's just no avoiding this this kind of substitution of identity, even when it's not necessarily the author's intention. So you need a certain amount of awareness of what the implications of non-humans, or in fact, I mean, really, this is true of any character, but there's a particular class, as you just pointed out, a problem that's going to arise with non-human characters. So the qualities of ugliness or ineffectuality in some particular mode of being, uh, the prospect of the human character rescuing them somehow, to perform an act of colonialization in some way. I mean, all these things can arise with complete naive unintentionality on the part of an author who's just not thinking about what the meaning of these things is.
I have a lot to say about this. I
Sure.
agree with both of these things. I think like definitely like for me like always like relating hard out with like the alien or the android or what have you. Like it's very much coming from like a neurodivergent axis, because my thought patterns like weren't ones that I often saw, and like various viewpoint characters. Luckily, I've been able to get like more of that lately, which is really nice. And then also obviously stuff like gender, like they have a spooky alien, and they're like, this alien doesn't understand gender. That's so weird. And I'm like, interesting. Tell me more about that one. That one's mine. But my advice, and that's why a lot of us like love characters like this, I think, and I wholeheartedly support us getting to write as many androids and aliens and fae and dragons who are like a whole variety of like neurotypes and like have different genders and sexualities and ways of thinking and seeing the world. The key piece of advice that I always give if anyone asks me about this is if you have like a class of aliens or non-humans who are like kind of have the vibes of like autistic people, that's fine, you can do that. If you're writing also humans at the same time, just have some autistic humans there as well. Just do both of the things. Just have both of them, because I find that very useful in terms of not over projecting on the non-humans too much, like kind of not accidentally saying the thing of autistic people are aliens, for instance, and instead like I don't know, like here are some interesting ways that like these particular types of people can like interact or understand each other. I don't know, but just it's a good way to sort of avoid that particular pitfall, I would say, or at least make it easier to avoid.
Yeah, if you're like, all of these aliens have they them pronouns. Isn't that cool? Wait, there
So
are no
alien.
so alien. There are no
So
non-binary
weird.
human characters. It's like, wait, that no, that is not the good that you thought it was, friend. But
Yeah, I mean, if all of your characters are, white, cishet, people, then of course this other group they interact with is going to start to seem like stand-in. So yeah, diversify your cast of characters is a good way to avoid that if if you're not comfortable with that association being made, at least too directly. Um, okay, so you've written a story like this, and you've done your research, and you've made sure that you're saying what you want to say. Maybe you've run it by some other readers who've let you know if you've got anything mess up or not. Where do you send stories like this? I'm curious if any of you have certain markets that stand out to you. If you're writing short fiction, I guess I should say. Otherwise, maybe you put it in your novel. But how do you tackle that? Do you find that there are certain markets that are more open to this sort of thing?
escape pod. Sorry, just kind of came out. Send stuff to me. Thank you.
I really don't think of the range of markets that way. There may be a few that are either so narrow in their focus uh, that I wouldn't come up with a story that centers on non-humanity, and to send to them. But I mean, the majority of science fiction and fantasy markets seem open to pretty deep explorations these days. I mean, that's a good thing.
Absolutely. I think that's true, right? Like most of these markets are at least willing to take a look at it, and you always want to let them tell you no rather than reject yourself. So, yeah, that's probably the easiest answer is send it to lots of the top pro markets because they all probably like this kind of stuff, have done well. Um, so, I mean, it occurs to me that you can try this in a lot of different genres, right? Like you can go from the sci-fi point of view where you're really trying to explore the realistic way in which artificial intelligence might be programmed. And so the influence of the human programmer is seen in the way that the machine thinks, right? And that was something that I did. But like you can also go from it from fantastical points of view where it's magic. And if it's magic, you can do whatever you want. And perhaps this animal type character or fantastical being thinks in a way that's pretty much recognizably human. And what sorts of, I guess, what sorts of goals could you have in choosing different characters like that, and how might that vary? Like what, like as a writer, like tactically, how are you choosing these things? Does anybody have any ideas, either from their own writing or just thoughts about that?
I'll do a short answer. I usually
Okay.
try. I'm going for a joke. Usually, that's it. It's. I'm writing funny things, and so I try to make funny non-human characters, and that's where I'm going from.
Hmm.
Well, there's a place for kind of, especially in melodrama, for characters with extreme human qualities. So extremely innocent, extremely pure-hearted, extremely valorous or self-sacrificing, extremely wicked, extremely monstrous. And when you, if you associate these with a human character, you wind up with something that will ring false if the tone of the story is attempting to be realistic. So for me, anyway, in Dickens, the pure-hearted, sweet characters are things I want to read past. It's the rogues and the complicated and ambiguous characters that interested me in Dickens, and I think he does a good job with them. So, in Bleak House, I don't really care about what's her name, the sweet self-sacrificing main character. I want to care. I'm reading about the rogues who are trying to manipulate the case. So as a writer, if I want to focus reader attention on some character like that, it has to be non-human if it's going to work. But there's also the case in a secondary world or in a far future world. If I do want to have marginalized characters, first of all, I don't want to appropriate an identity or an experience that I don't have, but I may want to have characters who are in some inferior position because of whatever the nature of that society is. So it's easier and more comfortable to use non-humans in that role. In my contemporary series, I'm using demons kind of as the ultimate victims of late-stage capitalism. They're being summoned and enslaved to use as financial analysts by the major investment banks, you see, because of their prognosticative powers. But but at the same time, I mean, all these characters, they're supposed to be real to some extent. They can't, if they're just caricatures, even in comic work. You can't take the joke seriously. So they always have greater dimensionality than the symbol or the thematic use.
For me, I think a lot of it kind of comes down to vibes. So it's kind of like what you want to achieve with that specific story or setting or character or like class of people. I was thinking in some ways it's easier for fantasy writers, specifically the kind who are drawing from existing folklore or mythological traditions, partly because there's kind of a thing to work from, and also partly because those are stories told by people. So there's already like the non-human characters in those are often like kind of exaggerated, say, but also are meant to be understandable by people and have been made by people with like human biases, just often like kind of very exaggerated, maybe. Like there's the one who's really tricky, there's the one who's like stupidly brave, and that kind of thing. So that can make it easier if you want to just have a non-human character who like stands on similar ground to like the other characters in your cast, for instance. On the other hand, even in like secondary world fantasy, you can also just go like whole hog and like create entirely new species with their whole entirely new cultures and cultural backgrounds. And you can also do that like, so if you want to do that, if you want to world build like what a completely different way of looking at the world would be like. So really you have a lot of power as an author, which I think is something we should celebrate because it's pretty cool. You can just make stuff up and write it down. So yeah, it kind of depends what you're going for with that specific narrative. There's advantages and disadvantages to a lot of the different types of non-human characters.
Love that. It's a tool in the toolbox, right?
Sorry. I was just wanted to interject. There's something essentially fun about the profession of writing science fiction and fantasy or any kind of speculative fiction. You have that joy of projection into these roles that you could never even conceivably assume, and ideally that nobody has ever conceived of before. If you are a bit overweening, but. At least you have the ability to define these wonderful new situations and settings for your hopefully somewhat new characters to play in.
And don't, I think don't forget about the reader, right? Like you have to give them an entry point into this because ultimately people are going to read this. And so if you get too down the line of trying to invent different ways of thinking, it may be impossible for someone to follow, and you can get into trouble with that. So I want to leave a little bit of time here for audience questions. I marked one down I saw in the chat. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and put them in there now. I did see AJ asked early on, how much harder is it to write non-humans when there is no verbal language, or when there is, but more communication is nonverbal, i.e., body language, sense, etc. So different sorts of communication, especially nonverbal, especially in a written form, right, where it's words. How do you tackle this? If anybody has an answer.
Well, I mean, sometimes it's actually quite easy when the non-human is supposed to be mysterious, when they're not supposed to be the main character or have a point of view, when there's something when they exist to perplex and annoy your real characters. So you don't have to define them with great clarity. You don't have to fill them out. They can just be, they can really be caricatures because they're so mysterious that they're never quite understood. So, they're doing these inexplicable random things. They're never saying anything. Every so often they do something helpful. Sometimes they do something harmful, but nobody can tell why.
Right.
So, that really can portray an effective sense of mystery and creepiness or horror or intrigue, as the case may be. But it's kind of a cop out,
It can be a feature.
Doing it, more seriously and wholeheartedly with this being a supposedly substantial main character, that's a lot more challenging. I haven't actually done that.
Well, Ram, I'd be curious to know if you've attempted that.
First, like, my main thought is I really like how Charlie Jane Anders did this in The City in the Middle of the Night, where the main alien civilization communicates through the sharing of memories, through which they communicate a lot of specific stuff. I think that kind of thing can make it easier. It's kind of like a good, not a cheat, but it's a good hack if you have a character who doesn't communicate in verbally or linguistically, but can maybe share their mind with you, and you get the images, for instance. I know there's a lot of non-human characters, although I can't think of the other specific ones, who communicate through flashes of images or memory, which is helpful. And then there's always, complicated games of charades. I'm trying to think of how I've done it. My mind is really on octopuses lately. I have two entirely separate stories that I'm thinking about in two quite different settings, which will depend somewhat on different types of octopus people. There's going to be some aliens in the science fantasy setting, and then there's a pirate novella that I'm planning. And both of those, the octopodes will because they communicate kind of through color, through the shifting of
Yep.
color on their chromatophores and stuff. So it's a question of how is a human going to understand that, and then also how on earth is a human you're just gonna fetch out a bunch of colored flags? How do you communicate on that whole different viewpoint, that whole different sensory thing? It comes back to Val's cool point about a good way to convey kind of a non-human feeling and a non-human character is if their sensory filters are quite different. So if you have things that communicate through pheromones like insects do, I mean, humans would just have to make a translator, I guess, but the initial few years would be a bit rocky.
Yeah, I completely agree, by the way, with that point that Val made much earlier about perceptual matrix defining cognition and modes of mentality. So if you want to start seriously to work on a non-human character whose modes of thinking are different from ours, then start with a different mode of perception of the world for them.
Even a different type of thinking, right? If they're an energy being, there's that, but also a creature with an organic creature with a brain going through all of its different limbs, or several small brains, or a brain that is concentrated in several very small creatures like a colony organism. That's gonna think so differently, and it's a really fun challenge to try and convey that in human text.
Yeah.
Valerie, you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm team translator for my series personally because I feel like if you are and this again, it goes back to it's all about your world building, your characters, your voice, and your plot, and what you are assembling and why and how you're doing it. And so I went with universal translators. Everybody has them. Some have better models, some have worse models, some have the latest firmware update, some have to get the latest firmware update. And so things are constantly, like Wikipedia, basically being updated and modified and edited and appended and changed because language changes, and it is a constant process for us even as humans. And to expect that it would not also be a constant process for non-humans strikes me as weird, because you also want to have not what do you call it, homogenous non-humans, right? And so Murderbot's a great example. There are lots of different kinds of bots in Murderbot. They're not all the same. And so even within a particular group, you're going to have a variety of cultures and subcultures, and they're going to have their own languages and colloquialisms and approaches to all this stuff. And so replicating that in non-language based stuff is really hard when we are writing a language based story. So like people have said, flashes of images. One thing that I use in mine is sense. So the non-human love interest communicates partially through scent, and one of the plot things is that the main character has a scent translator installed, and not everyone does. And so this guy is walking around smelling up places, and nobody knows what the hell it means except her, because she has the translator. But otherwise, obviously, other members of that species would understand it, assuming they're from the same culture, and the scents within that cultural group mean the same thing for them. So yeah, there's a lot to think about. Translators.
Oh, I'm seeing there's some chat here in the actual thing that I've been missing. Sorry, I've been in the Discord. So sorry if I've missed some stuff. I did just see a question pop up from Arturo. Sorry if I mispronounced that. How does a human artist succeed at creating the sensation of the non-human? How do you create a voice that successfully pretends to be non-human? Right, because we are kind of pretending when we are the ones who are authoring said voice. You want to take a crack at that?
We've already pointed out that unusual modes of communication can do
Right.
it. So I'm working on in my work in progress. I have it's a space opera heist story with only minority human cast. Most of the characters are obviously within the bounds of the people limit, but it does turn out that all stars are sentient, and that they just only recently realized that human scale life exists at all. And so this one particular star has created a sort of plasma avatar and compressed it down to human scale in order to interact with these weird little creatures. And so the avatar doesn't have any way to communicate directly, but it has been able to perceive biological and synthetic mind states. And so it communicates by changing people's memories so that they remember the impression of the information that the thing wants to communicate. The star wants to communicate. So I mean, this will clearly, I think, convey a sense of alienness or non-humanity to the reader. But I'm honestly cheating because I make the star think internally like a human, you know. I have a giant amoeba character who is a gossip columnist. They have to be very human to be a gossip columnist, despite the fact that they have various divergent qualities and they find bones exotic. So
I want to get to Rem for a
I feel
second. It
like
sounds like you had something to say about this.
Totally. I mean, I am
Yeah.
100% all for the giant amoeba gossip columnist. I think like the thing here is that like it's okay to cheat. It's okay to like find the hacks that like work for you. I think like for me like a fun thing, like I often write kind of like fair folk, like the she, like fae and stuff. A really fun thing is to really dig into those moral differences, especially for a character like that who is superficially almost human, like probably bipedal, probably has like hair and eyes and hands and stuff, and various features, but like is very very different internally. So just having that like different type of morality of like a character who is like, well, obviously you can just murder people if they insult you, but not if they ate at your table, come on. Like really driving home that kind of quite
Quality.
differing moral system is really fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also just going back to what was said earlier, keeping in mind the ways that different creatures would potentially perceive things, create your own, not necessarily a conlang, but a linguistic palette that you can draw from to describe things as you would imagine these characters would. And so if you are writing from the POV of a star, you would potentially have just concepts involving stuff like heat and light and just forms of energy, and so trying to create a vocabulary that expresses something like that. Whereas if you're drawing on robots, then you may be thinking about like, so in this latest book, I have a lot of robot characters, and so they will say things like, for cussing, it's like, oh, frag me, and it's like, yeah, that's a thing a robot would say, haha, very funny. It's a joke, I know, but just trying to create again that palette of terminology that you can then apply and use it. Think of it also as a lens through which you are having these characters view everything. And so in the way of Terry Bisson's or Man of Meat, you have these creatures who are like, oh my gosh, meat, pushing air through their meat holes and flapping their meat to make sounds, and how horrifying is that? And just considering how that functions, how these alternate characters would be perceiving all of the different myriad things that we perceive in a particular way, and how they would describe it differently, what their perceptions would filter things through. And be careful though when you're doing it that you are not replicating existing modes. I feel like I want to say autistic characters, they often end up, you have an alien who like sounds like an autistic person because it was used as shorthand, and it's like, don't do that though, please, no. And just be careful, I guess, is
Yeah.
all I can say.
Awareness
advice.
is very important.
So we are in the last few minutes of the panel here, so I want to give everybody an opportunity to talk about where people can find them online, if they have any other panels or readings or anything like that remaining in Flights of Foundry. Let everybody know about those. Let's go around. Let's start with Lawrence.
All right, I have a reading tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, from this newly released Demons of Chioda book. I would love to see you there, and I will be happy to give away ebooks of previous things in the series. To find my stuff, you can either visit my website or look me up on Amazon, I guess, if you have to. I'll drop a link to my publisher for this series into the Discord and my website. Lots of stuff there for free.
Yeah, I'll invite everybody in the panel if you're willing to drop your links in the Discord so people can find them. Valerie.
Yeah, you can find me at valerievaldez.com. I'm also on Twitter, also at Valerie Valdez. I'm on Instagram and Facebook as Valerie Valdez Author. And you can grab Chilling Effect, which is the first book in my series. That's in, every place that books are existing, I guess. And the new one is Fault Tolerance. That comes out in August. So you can pre-order it now. Please pre-order it now, please. It will make my publisher so happy.
All right, Ren.
I will drop my links in chat, but you can find me on Twitter as @FayWriter. I have a website, renwigmore.com. My novel Fox Hunt is available now from Queen of Swords Press, and they're doing a sale for Flights of Foundry. So, and the sequel will be out later this year as well. Thanks for having me.
That's fantastic. And once again, I'm Luke Elliott. I have a reading tomorrow. It is at the very end of the con. So if anybody's still around, I'd love to have you come check it out. I'll be reading that story I've referenced a couple times. And you can find me on Twitter at LuminousLuke. Or you can find my podcast on its website, inktofilm.com, which I will link, or I already have linked in the chat. But yes, thank you to everybody for showing up, and thank you to our wonderful panelists for sharing their insight. And I hope you have a great rest of the con. Oh,
Yep.
Look at that. We're a minute under time.
So efficient.